In this video I'll explain what identities are in JobPro. An identity is a bit like a multi-company feature, except in this system each identity is shared the data across the system. So you don't necessarily need to log out and log in under different companies. So to set up identities, click on Setup and click on My Company. Now most companies using the system will probably have one identity, but if for example you've got multiple branches, or even within the one building you've got different departments that you'd like to set up with different logos, different company or identity name, you can do that in here. So for example then, on a quote or an invoice, you can specify the identity specific to that customer or that quote, and then when you print out or email that quote, it'll have the relevant logo and company details on that. So in the system there'll always be one default identity, so that every time you create a new customer or supplier, that it'll default to that identity, although for that company or supplier you can change the default identity for them. On the identity section, you give the identity a name, logo, company name, subheading, which is usually an address and phone number, and there's also an area for specifying the default stock location. So in the system, under the locations module, you will always have at least one stock location. Even if you don't track stock, the system will set up one for you. You can also track stock at multiple locations in the system. If you don't track stock at all, you can just leave the default set to 1 here, and it'll be ignored throughout the system. So in this example, we've got the same company name, same logos, but set to different addresses and different identity names. So for example, if we had multiple branches in different countries. Over on the right hand side, we can specify what we'd like to refer to an identity as. For example, branch, company, department, office, store, or you can click in and enter in your own name there. So then everywhere throughout the system where you see an identity, it'll refer to it in the name that you'd like to call it. Also, we've got a default identity to section. Now what that means that if, for example, you create a quotation or an invoice linked to a company or an individual, if the default is set to employee, what that means is that the identity on that quote or invoice will default to the identity of the employee that's currently using the system. Or if it's set to company or contact, it means that when you create the quote or the invoice, it'll default to the identity linked specifically to that company or contact. Or if you select leave as entered, it allows the user to change the identity on that particular record or transaction. So that pretty much covers setting up identities. So let's take a look at identities in use. So if, for example, we go into companies, and here we're looking at a supplier, and there's their default identity, but we can change that default identity in here. You can do the same with contacts as well, where you've got the identity linked to each contact and you can change that. If a contact has been created from an actual company record in the companies module, well then the identity will usually be the same as the identity that they're linked to for the company, and you don't actually need to edit it here. So if, for example, we go into quotes, create a new quote, link it to a customer, that their default identity is set to Dublin, but we can actually change it in here as well. And you can control in setup under user prefs or access privileges for each user who can change the identity in the different modules throughout the system, because it might be something that you want to control at a user level. So one of the main uses of identity is that when we print a document, so let's add an item to this document. Put in some quantities. And then we click print. And we can see then it's using the actual identity linked to the one for that particular record. Also, when creating reports, for example in the quotations module, if we like to do a report by customer detailed and we want to click on find to do a search, we can actually specify the identity at this level as well. So we might want to do a search on any quotations that were entered from a specific date or a date range tied to an actual identity, and you'd specify that here and then click continue. If you do track stock, each identity is linked to a default stock location in and stock location out. So for example, if we go into purchase orders, create a new record, linking it to a supplier, and the default identity in is Dublin, and for that identity the default location in is the main stock location. So when we actually receive goods on this purchase order, they'll be received into the main stock location in Dublin. Using access privileges, we can control if a user is allowed change the default stock location in that's linked to a particular transaction. So that pretty much covers the use of identities in JobPro.